Hello, lovelies. Welcome back to my channel and the very first bread making video I'm doing. Today I'm making my version of a basic sandwich loaf, which is pretty fancy, all things considered. I'm using three-ish cups of bread flour and about-ish a cup of all-purpose flour. I don't measure too intensely most of the things. I have been making bread intensely enough. I won't say long enough, but with enough intention for long enough that I can kind of feel if it's doing what I want it to do. So I'm not very good for sharing the recipes. So I have 3.5 to 4 cups of flour, whatever blend you prefer. You could use all-purpose flour, all bread flour, even some whole wheat flour, or I've even done it with bread flour and oatmeal, just instant oatmeal. And also that is about 3 tablespoons or just shy of a quarter cup of brown sugar, which also could be white sugar or cane sugar. This is SAF instant yeast, which is what King Arthur flour uses in most of their recipes. I use 2 teaspoons, which is about the same as a packet of instant yeast, which is a good thing to use instead too, if that's all you have. When you make this recipe yourself, you can substitute the 1.5 cups of milk I like to use with just water and replace the half a stick of butter with oil. Olive oil is really good. Just a neutral oil like vegetable or canola oil I'll use sometimes. I heat that up in the microwave for about like a minute and a half and then just let it sit while I do this next part, because I also add an egg. Also entirely optional. I like the way it makes it light and fluffy. When you do it like that, it's called an enriched dough, which is just very tasty. This is the kind of bread dough you could use quite easily for something like cinnamon rolls, or potentially even I've considered trying to turn it into like a brioche bread, where you just knead in a heckin' ton of butter while you're kneading it, and I think more eggs. I'll have to double check on that. That is a project that is being reserved for when Ethel, my KitchenAid mixer, gets back from the appliance hospital, because I broke her. I like to mix the egg in with the dry ingredients before I pour my milk and butter mixture in, because I don't really take the temperature of it. I'm not entirely sure how hot or how cold it is. Like, I'll touch it and be like, oh, that feels kind of warm, and throw it in. And I don't want to risk cooking the egg or killing the yeast all that necessarily before it's had a chance to do anything. And just mixing it up helps give me a little bit more of that buffer before I go in and start mixing and kneading. I like to mix in the bowl for quite a while before I dump it out. A couple of times I've made this dough and it's been really humid, and I've been really generous with the milk and used oil instead of butter, and I never got it to stop being sticky, and I was refusing to add more flour to it during that phase of the bread making. But now I will, for like the first half of the kneading process, as you'll see. At one point I didn't remove it from the bowl at all, and I literally just like stirred and folded and screamed for about 45 minutes while I made my bread. And it was fine. I just did not like that process enough to replicate it. About the time where it starts to stick more to itself than to the bowl, kind of like this, is when I'll start to think about pulling it out. If the butter didn't completely melt in the microwave, I'll try and fold it in and get that to disappear as much as possible. But again, I don't really bother. Depends on the day, how I feel. I like to use a rubber spatula for this part, but you could also just use a wooden spoon or my favorite tool, a bowl scraper. It's just a curved piece of plastic, and it is so satisfying to use. This is one of those breads that can be used for just about anything. You don't have to shape it into a loaf. You can adjust the ratios, play with what you're doing. It's a great basic starter bread, or more accurately to say, it's come from my basic starter bread. Because the way I see it, a really good basic bread won't make you use milk. It won't make you use butter. It'll be just flour, yeast, sugar, and salt, and water. Maybe some oil. But after that, it just starts getting fancy and fun, and there is nothing wrong with that. I put a lot of flour on my kneading board for this one because it was also very humid in my apartment, and I don't think I end up using all of it. I sped the kneading process up by like 8 times because it's literally just me standing here for 30 minutes pushing dough around. I like to go by feel on how sticky it is, whether I need to add more flour to the thing, or right now I used a bench scraper to just scrape the rest of the flour off and continue kneading, because too much flour in your dough will make it feel dry, and when it stops sticking to you rather than to itself, you can just take the flour off. And sometimes I'll grease it. Sometimes I'll put a little bit of canola oil or vegetable oil on there. Oh, removed a hair. The little window test to see if it's ready. It was not satisfactory. And just keep going. There's a lot of different techniques you can use to knead. I like using the palm to push in like that heart shape. It's very fun. And this is how I like to finish it. I really get to know if the dough is happy or not just by smushing it around. And then I don't know how to explain what I'm doing here other than just turning it inside out so the outside is smooth-ish. It's literally like just cracking an egg and trying to flip it around on itself. At this point, the texture of the dough is somewhere between Play-Doh and slime, and it just feels good. Like, I don't film it for this one, but I always slap it. To a clean bowl, which I am spraying with a little bit of pan spray. You can also just drizzle oil in there or something, but the pan spray was more handy. Smooth. I drop it in there and like roll it around a bit to coat the entire thing with oil so none of it dries out. So that way, nothing stops it from rising. You can cover it with plastic wrap, or sometimes I'll use a wet cloth, like a piece of muslin or just a linen towel, as long as it's clean and damp. So to keep the moisture levels pretty even. That's good for if you have a very dry kitchen that day and you don't want to use plastic. I do try to reduce the amount of plastic I use in my kitchen overall, but stuff happens. About an hour later, it'll have doubled in size and feel kind of like a water balloon that's mostly full, which is a fun feeling. That is my favorite baking pan. It is just a simple metal pan that I found at the thrift store for 99 cents using Baker's Joy, which is a name brand, And it is a freaking miracle because I've never had anything stick to a pan when you use baker's joy. And I have bundt pans shaped like roses and castles, and stuff still comes out. It's a miracle. Back to bread time now. I'm going to use I use the bowl scraper again to kind of loosen it from the sides so I can get it out without having to deflate it too much. I don't punch this one down and re-knead it. For some reason with this particular dough, the way I do it, that really messes it up. It just goes from being like the good texture to the bad texture really fast. So I just push it and flatten it into a rectangle a little bit wider than the pan and a satisfying amount tall. I'll fold it down, the top down to about the third of the way down. Fold the two corners there into a triangle-ish thing. Push it all down and try to get rid of the whatever air bubbles and whatever else may have accumulated inside the dough. And then I roll it up what I consider to be really tightly. Like I am pulling on this dough to get it to do that. Because the more tension you put in the middle, the more it's going to want to spread out in a spiral. So when you slice the bread later, you might be able to see it in just the way the bubbles are forming. It's really neat. Pull the bottom back over the top, pinch it closed, and then I just kind of fiddle with it on the board. I pull it really tightly against the bottom to try to seal that seam there. Eventually I'll get to the point where there's no seam on the bottom of my bread, but today is not that day. I use the same piece of plastic wrap as before, same towel. You will need to re-wet it, I bet, at least once before this process is through. And then let it sit for its proof, this time for about another hour. Ba-bam! It has that water balloon feel again. It should be like touching the top of the plastic wrap. And it should just, when you touch it, feel good. The next part I do is, again, fairly optional. I like to put another seam intentionally on it in the middle on the top. When this kind of bread bakes, especially, like I'll use a knife, see, or the little razor blades there. When you do bread like this with the amount of moisture there is, and especially with the egg in there, they will rise a lot more in the oven too. And with that, the insides need somewhere to expand. When you don't put the seam on the top, it will just pick a spot, usually around the edges where the bread meets the pan, which is fine. It doesn't overflow or go sideways. It doesn't necessarily make a weird shape or anything. I just like to be in charge of where that happens. So I just use the corner of a razor blade. This one was on its last use, so it was quite dull, and I had to do it several times, which I generally don't like to do. But we do what we must to get good bread. And that just gives the dough some idea of where the weak spot is on the structure, and it makes it very classically aesthetic bread dough look. Usually, I like to do like an egg wash on top. I also don't always do that. Today I wanted to be fancy and I used a little bit of milk because I couldn't find because I didn't want to crack a whole nother egg for it. And I'm going to use a spoon to put it on top because I could not find my pastry brush and just could not be bothered looking anymore, which is what I'm doing now and forgot to edit out, and I'm too lazy to stop and do that now. I'm going to just coat the top in milk. That's it. Make sure when you're proofing your bread, too, that you're preheating your oven to about 350 degrees. If you have a pizza stone or like a baker's stone, preheat that with it. It helps with my oven, especially because it doesn't have a very consistent temperature. Having the pizza stone in helps to make it stay hot the same amount of time, more regulated temperature environment. Because I couldn't find my pastry brush, you see me using a spoon. It's also effective. Bread is a very easy to make thing in that you don't need a lot of fancy tools. I made this bread by hand with a clean work surface and a couple measuring cups, basically. Throw it into the oven at 350 for 30 minutes to an hour. Like all things depending. I don't really time my bread. I listen to it so when I tap on the side, it makes a weird hollow noise. That's how I can tell it's done. And then I'll wait like 5 minutes after that before I pull it out. And it usually looks like this on top, which I think is just glorious. It smells amazing. It is so tempting to just like cut it open and bust into it right there. But please, please, please do as I say and not as I do, and let the bread cool completely. At least after your first bake, you can go through later and like reheat it if you want. I dump it out of the pan almost immediately to help with the cooling process, but also so the sides don't get soggy as condensation happens as it cools. I also like to tap on it several times to make sure it comes out with that good hollow sound. And then leave it sit for at least an hour if you can't wait until it is fully cooked or fully cooled. I use a bread knife to cut it. And I need to work on my bread knife cutting technique because I do have a tendency to drag the knife down through it, which creates a less pretty slice of bread. But that's it. And that is my go-to sandwich bread. The details for the recipe will be in the description, or at least my closest approximation of it. This is the best kind of bread to experiment with, to play with. I always advocate for playing with your food, playing with your recipes, making it work how you want it to. Suggestions for this one: instead of using a cup of all-purpose flour, try bread flour and whole wheat flour, or try 2 cups of all-purpose flour and 2 cups of wheat flour. Replace some of the flour with oatmeal or with almond flour. Use regular white sugar or cane sugar. Honey, molasses is really good too. It is a great base to figure out how you like your bread. See, I was even pointing out there the swirl. You don't have to always follow a recipe, but you have to know why the recipe works. The right ratio of flour and moisture and salt, whatever they are, the perfect bread is waiting for you. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Make some bread.